Hello once again, and welcome to the 9th of our lectures in this series on the foundations of Western civilization. In our last lecture, we talked about Sparta, one of the most famous and important of the Greek polis, and in this lecture we turn to Athens, surely the most famous, the most important, and in lots of ways the most interesting of the Greek polis. Now, we saw in talking about Sparta that a very orderly and therefore a very stable system was created. When we turn to Athens, we can forget about that. Order and stability are not words that we would use if we talk about Athens. We could actually say that what the Athenians did is proceed in orderly fashion from crisis to crisis. That probably captures the Athenian system and the Athenian situation as well as anything. The great story in Athens is basically this. It is a shift of power from a relatively small number of eupatrids. Eupatrids are well-fathered people. That's literally what the word means. Pater in Greek means father, as pater means father in Latin, as vater is father in German, as father is father in English, as père is father in French, as padre is father in Spanish. That, by the way, is a little lesson on the Indo-European family of languages, how we can see one word that is so similar across a range of languages. But that doesn't help us understand Athens very well. Back to the story. Athens had been run by well-fathered men. And over a period of about 2 centuries, political power was shifted to the demos, to the people as a whole. What people? That'll be part of our job to explain. What people indeed. But we move from eupatrids to the demos. Now, with the luxury of hindsight, we can see in Athens what seems like a very orderly process that has almost an air of inevitability about it. The Athenians marched forward to create a democracy. The process perhaps seems natural to us because we admire democracy and we suppose that others would share our admiration for democracy, and therefore we assume that the Greeks would have shared our admiration for democracy and that that's what they'd have done. They'd have said, well, we have a job to do. Let's create democracy. Rule by the people is what democracy means. But ancient writers, as a matter of fact, were not positively disposed towards democracy for the most part. Now, a little later in this lecture, we'll have occasion to see why that would have been the case. Democracy was messy, it was turbulent, it was unstable. Ancient writers didn't think that democracy was necessarily a good thing or the thing towards which political evolution ought naturally to tend. It is probably safe to say that at no moment during Athens' long political evolution did any leader say, sort of wake up one morning and say, I have an idea. Let's invent democracy. Let's have a democracy. Though the system became more and more democratic. There is something, ironically, accidental about the creation of Athenian democracy. As Athens leaders responded to problem after problem, crisis indeed after crisis, they accidentally stumbled upon a democratic system. So, let's observe that evolution over a period of time and see how exactly it worked itself out in the great polis of Athens. In the 7th century BC, much of the Greek world experienced a brief period of what the Greeks themselves called tyranny. Now, tyranny didn't mean bad guys. It meant something like a strong man who was a popular leader. In other words, the word didn't necessarily carry negative connotations. It was a sort of a strong man who was a popular leader. The 2 cities that in the 7th century, quite interestingly, escaped tyranny were Athens and Sparta. What was generally happening, again, if we think back to those tensions in that generative period as the Greek Dark Age was giving way to the Greek Archaic period, we talked, for instance, you may recall a couple of lectures back about the emergence of the hoplite, the ordinary soldier as opposed to the aristocratic man on horseback. And if a city is going to ask ordinary people to serve it and perhaps to die for it, may very well have to give them some share in the political process. Well, there was a great deal of social strife, a great deal of social contention in Greek towns. And in some towns, the popular classes, the popular groups who felt that they had been insufficiently rewarded for their contributions or had not been permitted to participate in the system, would bring forward one of their own as a great leader, or they might rally behind an aristocrat who sort of turned into a popular leader in the town. So tyranny spread across much of the Greek world. And this popular contention might have had economic roots, might have had political roots. It may have been rooted in the demographic pressures that we have talked about already. What is interesting then is how did Athens respond to this period of political contention as compared, for example, to Sparta? So everywhere else in the Greek world, or almost everywhere, tyranny. Sparta creates the Lycurgan system, which we talked about in our last lecture. In Athens, the process works a little differently. In 621, a man by the name of Draco was empowered in Athens to codify the laws of the city. Now, he did this, and he posted them on tablets in the Agora, in the Athenian marketplace, this big open square that I referred to again in the previous lecture. The law code was extremely harsh. Draconian is still a word we use for very harsh laws. But it represented a very interesting and important concession to those who opposed the arbitrary rule of the eupatrids. Aristocrats could basically rule at their pleasure, at their whim. In some ways, they really only had to answer to one another and not to anyone else. Making Athens' laws public was to establish in principle, not yet, truth be told, in fact, but in principle, the idea that Athenians would henceforth be governed by laws and not by men. It may occur to you ask, well, didn't men make those laws? And didn't some men have more power than others? So didn't the law still provide the opportunity for the powerful to rule? The answer, excuse me, the answer, of course, is yes. But the principle was established, that with a law as the public business of the people. You may recall we had mentioned that very same point several lectures ago, or a couple of millennia ago, depending on how you look at it, in Mesopotamia. Publishing the laws didn't relieve all the problems. Ordinary Athenian farmers still suffered cycles of boom and bust, of boom and bust. Remember, Athens has become a trading state. Farmers are always subject to the vagaries of the weather. They are subject to the vagaries of prices for crops. If there's tremendous amounts of cereal grains, for example, produced in the Black Sea region at one time, the price of Athenian grain goes down. If there are failures of crops elsewhere in the Mediterranean world, let's say on the coast of North Africa, the price of Athenian grain goes up. So farmers were suffering cycles of boom and bust. This generated problems. And there's another interesting group of people at Athens who have problems, and that's precisely the merchants. If Athens is going to be, as indeed it was, a great merchant city, it's going to attract large numbers of people who are fundamentally living by commerce. But these are not local landowners. They are not necessarily people with long traditions in the city, long rootedness in the city, family connections in the city. They are not simply the old, wealthy, landowning eupatrids. What will be their place in this new Athens? They are responsible for generating a great deal of its wealth, but they really don't have any place in the system. In 594, the Athenians appointed a man by the name of Solon. To this day, we still think of lawgivers as Solons. They appointed a man by the name of Solon, a eupatrid, a man from a very old, important family, as nomothete, as lawgiver. He was given an opportunity, really, to make a whole series of legal provisions to try to introduce some reform into the Athenian system. Now, Solon was an interesting person in lots of ways. He was a moderate. He was a person without personal ambition himself, as far as we can tell. He didn't seek to make himself famous. He didn't seek to aggrandize himself. He didn't seek to line his own pockets. After he was able to do this because he was wealthy enough to sustain it. After he passed his reforms, he left Athens for 10 years. Because he wanted the system to work without him there to pull the strings and push the buttons. He wanted this system to work for the Athenian people. So what kinds of things did he do? He's got wealthy landowners who really don't want to share power. He's got merchants who haven't quite found a place in the system. And he's got farmers who are suffering from economic cycles of boom and bust. So what's he going to do to help these people out? One of the first things he did was he abolished many debts and debt slavery. One of the things that happened to large numbers of farmers And of course, many farmers face this situation today. You borrow this year to get your crop in the ground, and boy, you hope that you can get that crop back out of the ground and harvest it in the fall and have enough money, A, to pay your debt back, and B, to put something in your pocket for yourself until next spring when you put your crop in the ground again. Well, if the crop fails or if the price falls dramatically, you fall into debt. And in Athens, when farmers fell into debt several years in a row, they could actually be enslaved by those to whom they were in debt. And some of these Athenians had even been sold overseas as slaves. So Solon puts an end to debt slavery, and he actually sort of bought back a certain number of the people who had been sold away. He changed the basic qualifications for office holding and for voting in Athens, from birth to wealth. At first you may say, gee, that doesn't seem like such a big change, changing from birth to wealth, distributing the right to hold office, the right to vote for office holders. But what Solon did was actually very clever. He created a system that we could call timocracy. That is to say, division of political power according to wealth. Plutocracy is a system where the wealthy rule. You know, the golden rule, whoever has the gold rules. That's plutocracy. Timocracy is to say, according to a scale of wealth, you have power, you have places in this society. One of the things he did is immediately equate the wealthiest of the merchants at the very top of the system, because of their wealth, with the greatest of the landowners. He built a place in the system for them. And so then right on down a scale. Basically, he created 4 classes by wealth. But he divided up then political participation according to wealth, and he found a way to build the merchants in, and he found a way even to mitigate some of the old powerful families who were a bit less wealthy than some of the other old powerful families. You might wind up with less power under Solon's system than you had had previously. He created a council of 400 that set the agenda for the assembly of all Athenian male citizens. Now, that's interesting. That is exactly the opposite of the system at Sparta. Here in Athens, a relatively small group chosen amongst the population as a whole, all right, not men over 60 or something of the sort, a relatively small group set an agenda, but the large group, the assembly of all Athenian citizens, got to say yea or nay. Now, it's true that the assembly was not accorded early on much initiative, but nevertheless they had the opportunity to vote on issues put to them by a council of 400. Well, Solon institutes this system, fairly moderate actually. Solon was also a bit of a poet. He wrote a poem talking about how he was like a great bird, and he put one wing over one party and another wing over the other party. Both parties were, in the generation after Solon, angry about what he had done. Some felt he had gone way too far. Some felt he hadn't gone nearly far enough. It's an interesting thought. I mean, if you were a politician and you had people on both sides of you who disliked you equally, might that be a hint that you'd done about the right thing? Well, I don't know. I leave it to you to decide that. But there did remain problems. Not all of the difficulties, not all of the stresses in the Athenian system had been addressed by Solon's reforms. And as a result, round about 560, the lower classes elevated a man by the name of Pisistratus to a very mild form of tyranny in Athens. He really left most of the existing institutions in place and ruled alongside them, even ruled through them. He didn't really supplant the institutions, so he wasn't quite a tyrant in the 7th century Greek sense, and he certainly didn't have the kind of domineering power that some of those tyrants had had. He, and then his sons after him, dominated the Athenian political scene for about 40 years. What did Pisistratus do? Well, in the first place, he respected most of Solon's system. He didn't really change Solon's system dramatically, but he did redistribute some land. You see, one of the interesting problems with Solon's system, Solon put an end to debt slavery, and Solon bought back certain numbers of people who had been sold into slavery. But if you bring back a former farmer and you don't give him any land, what's he to do? He becomes part of an urban poor. He becomes part of a permanent underclass. So one of the things that Pisistratus did was mildly to redistribute land. How many times historically has land redistribution been a fundamental issue of people who are or who see themselves as reformers? Okay. Pisistratus did some other interesting things too. He inaugurated a whole series of festivals at Athens. The great Panathenaic festival, about which we'll have more to say in later lectures, for instance. he initiated massive public building projects in Athens. The first great set of public buildings in Athens were built mainly in the time of Pisistratus. Now, he did this for a number of reasons. At one level, it was boosterism. He was really trying to make people proud of Athens. He wanted Athens really to be something and to stand for something. And that was important. He was trying in a certain way to get people to focus their loyalty on the city and not on their particular class, their particular economic group, their particular geographical area, their own partisan interests. But there's another side to this that has led some historians actually to speak of an Athenian New Deal. Somebody had to do the work of building all these buildings. And as you had this increasing underclass, and you couldn't redistribute enough land to take care of all of them, you could put large numbers of them to work, basically at state pay, to build these buildings. So these then, in the time of Pisistratus and of his sons who came after him, were some additional measures that the Athenians envisioned as ways of sort of siphoning off some of the political tension in the Athenian system. Eventually, the Spartans allied themselves with a number of Eupatrid families in Athens and threw out the Pisistratid regime. The Spartans had had enough of this regime. It looked a little bit too democratic to them. It looked a little too unstable to them. It just might give other people, like members of the Peloponnesian League, for instance, funny ideas about politics. What the Spartans wanted is a nice, stable Athens in the hands of a bunch of rich old men who wouldn't disturb the situation very much. Well, there's a wonderful law of unintended consequences in politics. What happened is a Eupatrid, a real blue blood, a man by the name of Cleisthenes, was elevated to power and given the opportunity to make some new reforms. Well, Cleisthenes was on the outs with a lot of the other Eupatrids. He really wanted to introduce some fairly moderate reforms. They were going to block him at every step of the way and say, you know, we've had enough of all this reform business. We don't know anything more. So Cleisthenes was sort of drawn to do a great deal more than sort of ever he would have dreamed probably at the beginning, and certainly a whole lot more than the Spartans ever envisioned when they thought they had thrown out exactly people like this. From Cleisthenes to Pericles, let us say then, from about 510 BC down to about 450 BC, over a period of about 60 years, 2 generations, let's say, full democracy emerged in Athens. Or we can say the Athenian democracy became as fully democratic as it would ever become. How did that happen? Well, Cleisthenes, as I've indicated, was very much disappointed with the Eupatrids, so he turned to the demos. He turned to the Athenian people. He began to build the people into the Athenian system in a much more decisive way than ever Solon had done, and even where Pisistratus had done this emotionally, psychologically, and to a degree economically, Cleisthenes began to do it institutionally. He began to build the demos into the system. He created, for example, a new council of 500. Now, it was divided up into groups of 50, which formed a kind of a rotating executive committee that sat for a month at a time. The way he developed this council, it's actually very, very complicated, but there's a very simple idea underlying it. It's quite interesting. People then in Athens spoke of the plain, the coast, and the hill. Now, these were shorthands. The plain was the plain of Attica, the great farmland. The coast meant the port, meant the merchants. The hill meant the uplands, the bad farmland. What Cleisthenes did, in a way, was gerrymander the political structure of Athens so that he took a group of people from the plain, a group from the coast, a group from the hill, and made them one group. And then another group from the plain, and a group from the coast, and a group from the hill, and made them one group. He made 10 such groups. And then each of these groups could choose 50 members annually for the council. Now, what he was trying to do was break down local interest, break down family interest, break down occupational interest, and make people cooperate, make them think about Athens. Pisistratus, remember, had the idea of doing this by making Athens beautiful, make something you're really proud of. Cleisthenes said, no, I got a different idea. I'm going to build an institution that makes people cooperate. He opened virtually all offices to almost all men. Remember Solon's timocracy, Solon's system of arraying political participation by wealth. Cleisthenes opened up virtually the whole system to almost all men. There remained a few political disabilities. We'll see 1 or 2 of them go away here in 10 or 20 years or in just a couple of minutes, depending on how you want to look at it. But essentially, men could now vote and men could now hold office. Cleisthenes introduced something else very interesting too. One of the most distinctive features of the Athenian system, ostracism. Now we know what ostracism is. We ostracize somebody we don't like and we won't talk to them and so on. Ostracism worked a little differently in Athens. Ostraka is the Greek word for a potsherd. Once a year, the Athenians were bidden come to the agora and they could vote. They voted by writing a name on a potsherd. If a sufficient number, several thousand, if a sufficient number of votes were cast, then whoever got the most votes had to leave Athens for 10 years. Cleisthenes' idea here was that anybody who really angered the demos, either by doing things that were foolish and stupid on the one hand, or by doing things that were damaging to the interests of the people on the other hand, would get their comeuppance by being thrown out. Obviously, you didn't campaign for ostracism, but people might and people did get ostracized. So ostracism, potsherdism, is actually what the word means, from the ostraka. After Cleisthenes, there were some additional reforms that came into the Athenian system. For instance, from 490 until 478, the Greek world fought a massive war with the Persians, a war in two great phases. We'll have something to say about those Persian wars in a couple of later lectures. For now, I simply want to say that it was the Athenian navy, finally and above all else, it was the Athenian navy that won the war. The lowest class citizens in the state, the ones who had been left at the bottom by Solon, the ones who had really not been quite fully incorporated by Cleisthenes, were the rowers in those ships. They found a great leader in the Athenian general, we would actually say admiral, Themistocles. Themistocles then managed to get laws passed through the Athenian assembly, essentially to make the lowest class, represented by those sailors, fully able to participate publicly and politically at Athens, to vote, to hold office, and so on. So, in crucial respects then, the last sort of pieces of the Solonic and Cleisthenic limitations were knocked down. Now, in the 460s and 450s, Athens experienced a period of leadership by two men, Ephialtes and then by Pericles. Ephialtes and Pericles together removed in many respects the last vestiges of aristocratic privilege in the Athenian system. They did basically two things, a number of things, but two that I think are particularly important. First, they stripped the old Areopagus of all its rights of judicial review. This is a body not unlike the ephors in Sparta. It was a body of eupatrids who could sort of pass judgment on the constitutionality of measures passed by the assembly. It remained as a kind of an institutional brake on the full operations of the Athenian assembly. So the last review powers of the Areopagus were struck down. The second thing they did is they introduced pay for public service. Now, this is often for us in contemporary America a controversial issue. Should we do it at all? Do we pay our legislators too much money? Should we pay them less money? Do they have the right to vote themselves raises? We get very heated up about this issue. And we should. That's fine. But there's something very fundamental about paying people for public service. If you did not do it, and if you were an Athenian or you were an American living right now, only the idle rich could serve. Only the idle rich, not even the working rich. Because if you're a person who has to get up every morning and go to your job, you can't for months at a time, weeks at a time, months at a time, or maybe even more or less permanently over a period of years, simply give up everything you do. So pay for public service is also in critical respects a democratizing force. So we get to about 450, and as a result of one crisis after another, virtually all men can participate. Virtually all men can vote, and there are no checks on the system such as wealth. If I'm not wealthy, I can't afford to serve, or an old aristocratic body serving as a brake on the laws. How did the system actually work in practice? Well, the Athenian system had a very weak executive. The executive officers, they were called archons. Archon in Greek means a ruler. There were 3 of them elected every year. They were relatively weak. They weren't powerful. They weren't as powerful, for example, as the kings at Sparta. The critical institution at Athens became the assembly. It was here that the ordinary Athenians could participate. And from all indications we have, indications in the Greek historians, indications in dramas, indications in surviving speeches from some of the great Athenian orators. Debate was vigorous in the assembly. People really did speak. They really did argue. That's important if we want to think about a democratic system. It's also true to say that there was a danger of demagoguery in Athens. A demagogue is a leader of the people, and the word does carry a slightly unsavory connotation. The assembly was, certainly its critics said, too easily swayed. It was too changeable. Now that produced a situation that also means that there was really no continuity in Athenian policy, or at least constitutionally there was no necessity of continuity. Remember, the Spartan system was designed in a sense to ward off change, to make change almost impossible. The Athenian system could accommodate change, but what it couldn't do very easily was put the brakes on change. We'll have occasion in a couple of later lectures to see some of the consequences, some of the implications of that fact. For now, I just want to remark it. Athens was freewheeling and wide open, and that's a good thing. But Athens was freewheeling and wide open, and that's not such a good thing. You see, there's two stories here, sort of good news and bad news. For whom did this system work? Well, for Athenian citizens. Who's that? Adult males with 2 Athenian parents. Perhaps 10% of a population of 400,000 people. So, for whom did it not work? Well, it wasn't for women. It wasn't for metics. Metics were resident aliens at Athens, people who had come there to work, people who had come there as merchants. It didn't work for slaves, who became increasingly numerous in the Athenian scheme of things. So, for something like 10% of the population, this was a remarkably democratic system. For almost everybody else, it was not. How was it financed? Well, after the Persian Wars, some of the Greeks, led by Sparta, simply wanted to go home. War's over, that's that. Some of the Greeks said, no, there remain Greeks on islands in the Aegean Sea and on the Ionian coast, on the western shore of Anatolia, who are still under Persian domination. Let us go and free them. Athens led that party. For a period of years, there was much cooperation among the groups of people who went to liberate the Ionian Greeks. And then in 454 BC, Athens turned this sort of voluntary association into an Athenian empire. And the Athenians collected with a vengeance tribute from that empire. Allegedly that tribute was to pay for the military cost, the naval cost of fighting the Persians. In point of fact, it went into the pockets of Athenians. It paid their politicians, for example, and it built those glorious buildings like the Parthenon. The Athenian system was also paid for by slave labor. Slavery was less prominent, less visibly prominent, less structurally prominent in Athens than in Sparta, but it was nevertheless an important component of the system. Who defended Athens? Pericles did, the great leader, in his funeral oration in Thucydides' great history of the Peloponnesian War, the wars between Athens and Sparta. And we'll turn to Thucydides, his history, and that oration in a later lecture. So I want to pause for the moment and say that almost everybody criticized Athens, attacked Athens. Plato and Aristotle, for example, said that what was wrong with Athens is it did not bring the best men forward. They said government should be by hoi aristoi, the best. Aristocracy is not by a bunch of people born privileged, but in the Greek sense, aristocracy is ruled by the best. Plato and Aristotle said never happened. Democracy is not going to bring the best forward. An anonymous treatise written by somebody called the Old Oligarch said that what was wrong with the Athenian system was that it lacked deference. It lacked deference for the great and the good and the important citizens. It was changeable. It was subject to demagoguery. You never knew what they were going to do next. Here was this call for stability. Thucydides gives us many examples of folly, cruelty, perversity. He really was giving the concrete examples of the kinds of changeableness that the old oligarch, that Plato and Aristotle and others had commented on. Thucydides simply parades the follies of the Athenians and invites us to reflect on them. And he does this despite being actually, and in the end, favorably disposed to Athens. What must our verdict be? Athenian democracy has, after all, as I've suggested in earlier lectures, fired people's imagination for 2.5 millennia. The Athenians demonstrated what a democracy might be. It remained for others to show how it might work and for whom it might work. Now, I said that a polis is a political and a social institution, and we've talked a little about Sparta and Athens as political and social institutions. I also said the polis is a cultural institution, and in the next several lectures, we'll reflect a little bit on the kind of culture that a polis makes.